Welcome to the recorded version of Understanding the Scams Seniors Face, part of the Family Caregiver Support webinar series brought to you by the American Society on Aging and a generous sponsorship from Home Instead Senior Care.
All right, our presenter today is going to be Molly Carpenter. Author, speaker, trainer, and family caregiver, Molly Carpenter brings years of personal and professional senior care experience and training to families dealing with dementia care. In her current role, Molly works with a team responsible for ensuring that Home Instead Senior Care Network's 60,000 caregivers worldwide have the resources necessary to effectively provide quality care in the home and understand the importance of their work enhancing the lives of those they serve. Molly holds a Bachelor of Science degree in Family Science with a gerontology specialization from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln and a master's degree in education with a gerontology specialization from the University of Nebraska at Omaha. And with that, I'd like to welcome our presenter for today, Molly Carpenter. Thank you again for being here with us this month again, Molly.
Thank you, Steve. Thanks for that nice welcome. And welcome all of you today to today's webinar. As Steve mentioned, this is one of the hard ones for me to do. I think it's a hard one for all of us to even hear about because we're going to talk about, scams that seniors face. But when we're talking about scams, that means we're talking about the vulnerability of our seniors that we serve. And it's very heart-wrenching. A lot of us got into this industry in this field because we love seniors and we want to work with seniors. And so when we talk about today's topic and their vulnerability, this is where this gets really hard. But we can help, and that's the good news, and that's the positive side of today. So I'm so thankful that you're all on the call to learn about some of these tips and resources and things that we can do if we spot some scamming going on. Because I know you've all heard horrible stories in your local media. I've heard them in mine. We've heard lots of different ways that seniors are being scammed, and I bet you all have a story or two that you personally know about. You may even have some personal experience with this. I know I do, and I'll share that with you later on today. But according to MetLife, it's estimated that 20 to 30% of older adults face some sort of financial exploitation. Now, the study that MetLife did, it's a huge variation because people are embarrassed to admit that they've been taken advantage of. So it's really a hard topic to also measure. And when MetLife, when they talk about financial exploitation, that's even hard to measure. And MetLife measures it by what was reported in the media. But we've learned recently in the last, I'd say 5 years, there's been so many technologies and companies out there that really offer protection over, identity theft and fraud. I know you've all seen those. So that group of companies also has a way to measure that. And ASA actually recently did an article in their monthly newspaper called Aging Today. And they give some stats from a company called TrueLink. And I wanted to share those briefly, too, before we get into this, that their data shows that it's $17 billion is lost to financial exploitation. And TrueLink defines financial exploitation as misleading or confusing language, often combined with social pressures and tactics that are targeted at people with cognitive decline. This company also estimates that $13 billion is also lost to criminal activity. Those are some examples of fake lottery winners. That's where the identity theft comes in and some of the scams. And then another $7 billion lost to theft by a trusting relationship from a family or a friend. So as I say these numbers, I'm kind of cringing. It's so hard to hear, and it's very upsetting. But again, as we go through today, I want you to think positive, and I want you to really be hopeful like I am that we're going to gain some understanding on this topic, and we're going to be able to help families understand the signs to look for, and which in turn is going to really help prevent these scams. Knowledge is the key here. So the goal is empowerment today, and we're going to empower our families, we're empowering each other, and we're going to educate people on the signs and symptoms of identity theft and scams. So let's look at the objectives on the next slide to get us started here today. So during this webinar, we're going to talk about the types of scams and fraud and abuse. We're going to look at the signs and recognize the signs. We're going to learn some prevention strategies that we can share with families. And always on these webinars, we love sharing resources. So we're going to share some resources, and I invite you all, if you've got resources, when it's the question-answer time, feel free to share some resources as well. Okay, let's start on the next slide about why seniors are targets. Why are they vulnerable? And when you do some research into this topic and you look at all the different organizations and law enforcement agencies that are involved in preventing or working, in the industry when seniors are being scammed, there's some common themes that come out of all of this research and information, and here's what they are. And number one is availability. Seniors are seen as a target because they're retired. They might be a little less mobile, and they're at home. So they're at home for phone calls, and they're also can be at home when people drop in and knock on the door and offer services. So availability is a huge one. Isolation and loneliness, the next two very similar. Isolation can lead to loneliness, but those are common. That's another target area because seniors are alone. They might be a little isolated from their community. I'm not saying all seniors are isolated, but occasionally they become a little more isolated. Maybe families moved away. Maybe they have less interaction with their neighbors. And because of that isolation, that's when loneliness can occur. That isolation can lead to decreasing opportunities to socialize with friends. And so when you start to not hang out with your friends as much and be as social, that's where this loneliness can occur. And so when a friendly cold caller calls on the phone and has this great pleasant voice, or there's a knock at the door and there's this nice gentleman offering some services like yard work or whatever, that might be an opportunity for a senior to visit with somebody. So we've got to look at that. And, we've even had a recent story in our media where we have a pretty well-known person in our community has befriended a couple of elderly neighbors, and now because of that and because he's been overly friendly, one of them has very severe dementia, and there's been a lot of money exchange, and so this person is under investigation, and there's a whole trial now and everything. So it can happen. It can happen in the communities. Sickness is another reason why seniors are targets. They have chronic health issues. When somebody is sick or has chronic health issues, it can be difficult to maintain their property, and scam artists know that. And the bad thing is that's visible. When there's a handyman or a yard person or whoever trying to look for work, they're driving by and they see a house that's not well maintained, and they can guess that maybe a senior might live there, and that might be a way that they're preying. So seniors are relying on outside sources for help with those types of things, for sure. And when those types of workers, when we see those dishonest type of workers, they can overcharge for services. That maybe things only cost a couple $100, and they're charging thousands of dollars. So we've seen that before. I'm sure you've heard those stories on the news. Prosperity. Money is one of the most notable reasons for senior vulnerability. Scammers see them as a supply of wealth, and that can include homes and property and life savings. And they have excellent credit, and they're easily approved for financing. That generation, they endured the Depression. They're a generation of savers. They want to have money to pass on to children, so they are seen as this group of people that have money. And then this one always breaks my heart, is seniors are polite and trusting. I think this could be said for most of society. A lot of us are polite and trusting, and we can get taken advantage of, but it's very much an issue when it comes to seniors. They're better at keeping their composure with callers and visitors, and they have a hard time being confident or dismiss things when they're uncomfortable. I can definitely attest to this with my grandma. I always tell stories about my grandmother. The telemarketer would call. She would never hang up on him. I would just say, hang up on him, Grandma. And she wouldn't do it. She wanted to listen to him and then politely try to say, thank you very much, but I'm not interested. So that's her generation. They don't hang up on people on the phone, And then the FBI is also telling us that older Americans are less likely to report a fraud. So that's another reason why they can be a target. Now, when you think about the reasons why they don't report it, first thing to consider is they don't really know who to report it to. I mean, when they think of the police, they think a major crime or there's an emergency happening. So they don't always rely on just calling the police. Another reason why they may not report it is they're too ashamed. Another thing to consider is they might not even know they've been scammed, okay? So we've really got to think about this when we're understanding why seniors target. I know all of you who work with seniors every day understand these themes, but when we're working with families, this is where we need to start thinking about the conversation, and we need to help a family understand why they are targets and kind of start building that case of why family really needs to stay involved with their senior and making sure that things are going okay. Now, we're going to look at the next slide, and this is just a simple PDF of a document of the METLIFE study that I've been talking to you about. I just want to show you that you can go and look at it. It's downloadable. This is where we got a lot of the information for today. So I just want you to know that that's where it's coming from. And I'm sorry, I have a tickle in my throat. We do have 3 types of scam and abuse that this study covers, and we're going to look at those on the next slide. Now, these 3 types are called crimes of occasion or opportunity, crimes of desperation, and crimes of predation. We're going to talk a little bit more about each of these in more depth, and I want to start on the next slide with crimes of occasion. Now, a crime of occasion, this is when a person has money or assets and an occasion presents itself for another person that's close in their life to steal from the person or steal from the senior. One story that I can share for you from the METLIFE study, it involves a Manhattan businessman, and he ended up being charged with grand larceny and forgery and other charges after stealing more than $330,000 from a 98-year-old semi-retired lawyer. So this perpetrator, he invited the victim to use his office space. I mean, this gentleman was 98 and still working. He said, hey, I've got some extra room. Come work in my building. I've got a desk for you, an office, all kinds of stuff. And this elderly man agreed. And after some time, he did end up falling and broke his hip. And that's when the abuse became. An opportunity presented itself. And the perpetrator had access to all of his financial information. And in his absence, when he was in rehab, getting back to walking again and all of that, that was a perfect opportunity for this gentleman to steal from the 98-year-old. He just dug in and helped himself to all of this guy's assets. So that's an example of a crime of occasion, or an opportunity presents itself. Now, on the next slide, there's some more examples of crimes of occasion that I want to discuss, because there's a lot of scams that can fit into this category, and one of those is identity theft. Now, this is when a senior gets a call, a letter, an email, something asking for verification information, and it usually involves some very, secretive information or stuff we should keep secretive, like our Social Security numbers. It may be looking for account numbers. And what the scammer on the other line does is uses that information to open credit cards or loans or lines of credit to purchase goods and services that are then billed directly to the senior but maybe shipped to another location. Now, this is a hot topic in the world right now, and I mentioned there's lots of different companies out there that can help us prevent this. But this is one of those deals where we have to be cognizant of a senior. They may not be as savvy to understand that this is happening. And all of us are, because we're hearing about it so much in the news, but this is where we need to remind our families about identity theft. Another type of scam of occasion would be health care or insurance fraud. These scams tend to offer something free or unnecessary, like some medical equipment or tests that a senior or health insurer thinks they need or should need, and then later they're charged for them, but they never get the equipment or whatever it might be. So that's an interesting one that we've heard a lot about. And then another one about prescription drugs. This is, of course, we've known this has been happening for many, many years, but being offered and sold counterfeit prescription drugs, this is when a company or an organization offers a discount card, or that it's selling, some sort of medication, and it's a fake company. Now, I kind of thought that everybody was onto this group, and that everybody sort of, like the powers that be, the FBI, and everybody was putting a stop to those. But even 2 years ago, is that soon as 2 years ago, in California, 1,600 fake pharmacies were shut down for selling counterfeit drugs. So I guess that's still a very huge concern, and we don't have a good grasp on that yet. So that's something very serious to watch out for, because they're always offering a discount, and we know who doesn't like to save a buck or two. So it's a real concern. And then there's internet fraud. This usually includes non-delivery of items that were ordered online and their credit and debit card scans. This is where we really, again, where savviness is the key. You and I have been on a website where we've looked at something and it doesn't seem right, and it seems like a weird website, or there's something not right about it. We can get some intuition around that, but that's where we have to be careful. When we're talking about seniors, we have to warn families about the internet usage and buying things online, and just kind of keeping up to date and making sure somebody's monitoring some of those things occasionally, that they're not stumbling onto the wrong website. And believe it or not, there's funeral and cemetery fraud, and this is where funds are taken in advance for services by a funeral home or a cemetery that don't exist. There's other offers, of all those. You can consider an anti-aging product a scam, because a lot of those don't work, and they're promising big results, and those never occur. There's some telemarketing fraud out there. Now, this kind of fraud actually targets older women who live alone, and this involves some sort of a free prize or sweepstakes or low-cost vitamins, an inexpensive vacation that requires immediate response, or some sort of prepayment of shipping and or handling costs. Okay, those are big warning signs to look out for. And recently, I ran across the story about a telemarketing scam, and this is where fake companies are selling some type of a medical alert or instant response system for seniors. And the company that the line the company was using for this scam was that your loved one wants you to be safe. Your loved one wants you to have this product. Your loved one would feel better if you had this medical alert system. And the cost was anywhere between $800 and $1,700 for that around-the-clock service for the monitoring. And the company sends a stamped envelope and tells them to put the check in it and send it back. And guess what? The service does not exist. And so I think that's one of the lowest blows, is when they're flat out lying, saying that their family member wants them to have this sort of a monitoring system. Also, those telemarketing scams can involve donations or requests for fake charities. So that's another thing to watch out for. We've talked a little bit about financial exploitation and schemes, but some of those are investment schemes, the pyramid and the Ponzi schemes. There's letter fraud, reverse mortgages that are sometimes can be where they're offered a free home. There's some investment opportunities or refinancing assistance. So again, a lot of these scams, they can happen to anyone, but these companies, some of these shady companies, they are preying on seniors. So I know this is a lot of information to take in. I know these are a lot of different areas to think about, but it's, again, we cover this today so that as you're talking to families, you can be mentioning some of these different opportunities that these scammers are looking for, so that families are always on high alert. Okay, let's look at the next type of crime, and that's the crimes of desperation on the next slide. Now, the METLIFE study defines crimes of desperation. Those are typically within the family or friends, and families and friends or a next-door neighbor. Somebody becomes so desperate for money that they'll do whatever it takes to get it. And often these are desperate family members that are dependent on the elderly parent or the senior for money and housing. Now, drug and alcohol dependency can be a factor in these crimes. And I saw an example of this. I saw an article about a man in Long Island who stole $100,000 from his 85-year-old mother to pay for his drug addiction. He also stole her money and jewelry for 2 years. There's another example of a drug addict in Maine. She was cleaning a senior's home weekly, and she stole prescription drugs for her to not only use, but also to sell. And so these are crimes of desperation, drug abuse involved. In other cases, when you think about a crime of desperation, we've got to think it's about entitlement sometimes. And I think this is one you guys might have heard about, you might have some personal experience around, is an exploiting family member or friend becomes involved and they believe they deserve the money from the senior or their elderly parent or whoever it is. And they think they deserve it for lots of reasons, but one of the biggest ones we see in this industry is that they're taking care of the older person, you know, quote unquote. And this can be a repeating pattern as well where they're taking extra money. And I do have a personal story with this, a very close family friend. Their mother lived with 2 granddaughters, and the granddaughter, one of them eventually moved out, but the one that stayed ended up, you know, getting married and having kids and always lived with grandma. And over the years, they started to notice that money was missing pretty regularly. And when they confronted the granddaughter about the money missing, she said, well, you know, that's for me because I'm doing all this care and I'm doing all this work, when the grandmother was completely independent. And then it came to the point where, you know, after that defense didn't work and maybe grandma did need a little help, it got even worse. And she said, well, I live here and I have to maintain this house and I deserve this money and this is what I get for doing all this, and so on and so forth. A real ugly situation, and really hard to evict a grandchild out of a grandparent's house, and very tough on a family, can rip a family apart. So again, these things are actually happening out there in the world. I know that it's very disturbing to hear, but we've got to be aware of these so that we can help families in the future. Okay, let's look at the third type of fraud and abuse on the next slide, and that's the crimes of predation. And this is where the person gains the victim's trust in order to steal from the senior. So we can call it predation or we can call it occupation, but really this is, there's a couple of ways that sometimes this can work or this type of crime works. And one is through the you building a relationship by a romantic relationship. So this is where that trust, where the person is really gaining the senior's trust. And this is kind of the classic example of the younger gold digger falling in love with an older person just to get a hold of aspects. So that's one aspect of a crime of occupation or a crime of predation, where you're gaining trust in order to steal or take. Another example, though, I think about this a lot, this one happening a lot, is around that where we're talking about workers and handymen who might be preying on seniors. And there is a story, again, this was in Florida. A 38-year-old man preyed on a neighborhood designed for seniors, and he passed out flyers with his services on it. And a woman hired him to paint her house, repair some damages inside and outside, and over time, the two became very close, almost like a mother and son. And the concerned neighbor, thank God, called authorities, and after investigation, they discovered through bank statements that not only did she way overpay for his services, but charges of skydiving and bar tabs and hotel bookings were coming out of her account. Now, this was around $50,000. So think about, that's just one woman. So we don't know how many else, but this gentleman is now facing 400 counts of financial fraud. So terrible, terrible story. Another one is where we read about the story about a court-appointed guardian, and her name was Marie. The senior's name was Marie, and she was quickly milked of all of her money that should have lasted a lifetime and then plenty for her children as well. But a guardian, her guardian that she hired actually owned the guardianship company, and they hired themselves to be her guardian. Actually, so she didn't have any children. I'm thinking of a different story. But so Marie had to hire a guardian to sort of manage her money and do some things. And then when Marie needed personal care, of course, this company also says, "Oh, we'll do the personal care." So they're double dipping from Marie because they're, quote, managing her day-to-day life, and now they're doing personal care. So they're charging Marie $15,000 a month. And so once all of her money was gone, guess what this company did? They left, and they withdrew as her guardian, saying it was too much care. So another company that's facing major fraud and many counts of financial fraud as well. So again, I hate to tell these stories because it kind of gets me down in the dumps, but I tell them because it's like hard for me to believe, and I'm sure it's hard for a lot of you to believe, but there really are these stories out there, so we just have to be very careful. There are bad people in the world trying to take from seniors, and the more we can educate our families, the better. Because let's look on the next slide, the impact of fraud, and we're going to start with the cost. And that really, when we look at the METLIFE studies, the researchers calculated the annual dollar amount lost by victims of elder financial abuse, and this was in 2010, and they estimated $2.9 billion, which is increasing year over year. From 2 years ago, from 2008, when they did this study, it was a 12% increase to 2010. And we already heard, think about the story I just told you about Marie, though. She lost all of her money, over $1 million, and she's now depends on government assistance. So then you've got to start thinking about the cost to all of us as taxpayers. And when you think about the company we talked about in the introduction, TrueLink, they're estimating more like $30 billion. So it really just depends on how you look at this issue. The bottom line is it's costing lots and lots of money, but the worst is the emotional toll that this is taking. And so let's look at that emotional toll a little bit deeper on the next slide. Now, when we think about these things, dollar costs are one thing, and that's devastating, but we also have to think about these emotional impact on the senior and the families. And we're talking about a loss of trust. We're talking about people becoming, especially seniors, more fearful and more suspicious. And when that happens, guess what? We're all less willing to act generously. And people are losing sort of a peace of mind or a sense of well-being. Imagine the impact on a person aging when these types of things happen to you and the devastation you must feel. A lot of us, as in our younger years, we can probably somehow reconcile. We can somehow make up for it. We have time to get back on track financially, earn the money back or whatever it is. We might be able to see counselors and seek help for this. But when you're 85 and 90 years old and these types of things happen, just think about the devastation on even the aging process. I talk a lot about how our emotions and what happens to us and how we feel about things and how we live our life, our well-being. It all impacts how we age. And so you've got to think about these emotional, toll that this can take on a senior as well. And, of course, when I give you all this information today and you're all hearing it, it can spill over to society. I joke occasionally about losing faith in humanity, but really when you think about these issues and hear about these stories, I become more and more suspicious as I get older of things or people because of all of these terrible things. So again, there's just some things to really be aware of, and we've got to think about the emotional side as well. Now, what gives me back faith in humanity is all of you being on the phone today listening and trying to help our families more. That restores my faith instantly. So good job again for being here today. Okay, let's look a little bit closer on the next slide about who the people are that are preying on seniors, because there are MetLife, when they did the study, again, they were analyzing all those articles, and this is what they found, that 60% of them were males, ages 30 to 59, and when there were female perpetrators, they were the ages of 30 to 49, and they often were strangers who targeted victims with visible vulnerabilities, and that's where I go back to the living alone, signs of living alone, like the yard, maybe signs of limited mobility, maybe even displaying confusion when, sometimes you can tell when somebody is a little bit confused, and that can just be the tips that the perpetrator might need. There's also, so when they looked at that, 51% of them were strangers. Also, reports of elder financial abuse by family and friends and neighbors were second, and that was in 34% of the articles that they looked at. And something to note about this, though, is that it's possible that stranger fraud might be more likely to be reported and publicized, to sort of, we got to stop this and we got to, get this person off the streets. But when it's a family or a friend or a neighbor, there's some shame in, exploiting or telling the person or reporting the person to authorities. And there's also could be a sense of fear of retaliation when seniors are abused by loved ones or trusted friends, okay? And that kind of goes back to my personal story. When we had the conversations with the grandmother, number one, she didn't want to admit that her granddaughter was doing it to her. It was terrible. It's a terrible shame to admit that that's what was happening. And number two, she was so worried that if she told or mentioned that things weren't right, what were they going to do to her? And I don't know if she was worried physically, but she still, they were her grandkids. She loved them. She still wanted to be part of their life. And so she was just worried about being cut off forever from her grandchildren. So got to think about that. And then other reports of exploitation occurred within the business sector. That's 12%. And then there was some Medicare, Medicaid fraud. I know we've all heard about that as well. In this study was around 4%. I know that can be higher in other studies and other articles. So, okay, then let's look on the next slide at the stats that make up the victims of these crimes. Now, what the MetLife study again found is that women were nearly twice as likely to be the victims of financial abuse, and these victims were between the ages of 80 and 89. They lived alone, and they required some type of care or home maintenance. And in most of these cases, there was a combination of valued independence, observable vulnerability that merged into the lives of victims to optimize those opportunities for abuse by every type of perpetrator, from the closest family member to professional crimes. Okay, so let's start getting to the, if there is the good stuff, let's get to the good stuff and start learning a little bit more about what are the signs of abuse so that we can learn these and we can point these out to families on the next slide. So there's ways that we can tell if a senior is being victimized, and this is good for all of you to get a reminder of as well, because a lot of you are in direct care with seniors. But again, this is great information to share back with families as well. So according to the National Committee for Prevention of Elder Abuse, there's lots of indicators, and not one of these means something's happening. It could be a combination or so when we look at these things, just be aware of them. And the first one, unpaid bills, eviction notices, notices to turn off utilities. That could be a sign that the money is gone. and that could be a red flag that something's happened to the account. That could also be a sign of dementia or some cognitive issues, but when we're thinking about scams, money is gone. That's our first red flag. Unusual activity in bank accounts, such as big withdrawals or lots of transfers or an unusual amount of ATM withdrawals. This is where we've got to look out for those bank statements, and we've got to encourage the families to look out for bank statements. Even those of you that work in direct care, and if a senior gets their mail wherever you're working at, encourage them to look at those bank statements. How often do we just put those in a pile and you don't even open them up because they're just the same thing over and over and you don't want to read it again? Well, we've got to, remind our seniors to look at them and remind our families to stay on top of those things. Missing bank statements is another clue, a sign of abuse. Maybe a person's always gotten them and now they're missing. If my grandmother would have been missing a bank statement, that would have been a huge red flag because she got it every month and she opened it and read it every single month. Okay? We've got to make sure that families, and as well as all of you, don't assume that the senior all of a sudden just went paperless. That's probably pretty unlikely. Another sign of abuse are new best friends. So when a new person comes into the senior's life, it could be a blessing, it could be wonderful, but it also could be, the wrong person. And this is where we've got this fine line of being suspicious versus just so grateful that a senior has a new friend. So we just got to make sure our families are aware of who is in their circle. If you notice somebody new hanging around, kind of getting to know the person a little bit better, some of the things like that. New legal or financial arrangements maybe that have been made. And that goes back to the mail. Make sure the family's looking at the mail, if there's any new legal documents, if they get any, those of you that work in facilities, if they're getting any type of certified letters to the facility, some of those are red flags as well, to maybe make sure the family is aware of a new legal document that's come. Belongings or property are missing. That's another, that's a pretty obvious one, but I think it's good to still note. That's where we should probably encourage families to keep a good record of key information. And I know in senior living communities and in different facilities, you often, do a whole statement of everything that you brought with you. Just, again, it's great record keeping, so that's important to do. Suspicious signatures on checks or handwriting looks off. This, again, reminding families to pay attention to bank statements. I think that's, again, just a huge, huge important thing, and it's very key. Now, the other thing is we say this a lot, that we've got to listen to what the senior is telling us. So maybe a senior is giving us strange explanations about their finances or why things have changed, or start to say something different like, I think something about a reverse mortgage. There's just some clues that we need to make sure that our families are listening to. Because a lot of you especially are intuitive to spot something, an unusual story or an unusual reason. And the other thing is that, like I said, one of these factors alone does not indicate financial abuse. And so we've got to look at patterns and we've got to investigate everything. This is that fine line of oh gosh, I think this person's getting abused versus, well, there's something different happening than usual and I want to draw your attention to it. All right, let's look at tips for avoiding fraud and scams on the next slide. This is where it really gets good too, where we can learn a lot of good information to share with our families. Now again, this is the National Council on Aging. There's, around 8 to 10 steps that can help seniors avoid being scammed. And the first one is to help seniors understand that they need to be aware and that they are at risk for scams by both strangers as well as those closest to him or her. Now, this is a fine line between scaring them and warning them, but this is where a lot of you come in and where your brilliance is, because families look to you a lot of times to have those conversations. You're the trusted healthcare professionals. So it's okay for you to say to talk to them or say things. Or, I remember one time in my days back in working in direct care, I had a gentleman one time, I was having coffee with him in the afternoon, and he said, I'm really thinking about, I saw this commercial for, I don't know when he saw it or whatever, but it was about reverse mortgages. I'm really going to look into that. I think that might be something I should look at. And I said, well, Jim, I think your house is, isn't it paid for? And, anyway, so I didn't shy away from it and say, yeah, that's a great idea, or yeah, you should look into that. I did ask him a couple of questions because I think that's what he was trying to feel me out to see what I thought about it. And then, of course, I just asked him a couple of questions because it might have been a great deal. I didn't know what commercial he saw or anything. But then when his daughter came in later that week, I mentioned it to her, saying, your dad mentioned this. I just want you to be aware. I don't know if it's anything, but this is what I said to him. And I think I invited him to talk to you more about it, and maybe you guys would do some research together. So, again, families are looking for us to do that, and so are the seniors. They trust us as health professionals. And all you guys, you come from a place of experience and knowledge. You know what's happening. You know the risks of these things. The other thing is I know we talk about this a lot, about a senior staying connected with friends and family. This is where I know it's hard, but we've just got to keep our seniors from being isolated. They need to stay involved in things, stay involved in religious organizations, stay involved in their favorite social activities. I think that's something where we definitely can be, we usually are, right? All of us, we are the encouragers, but we have to keep doing it. It's for good reason. Just always remember that. Don't feel bad that you're pestering somebody to stay involved in things. It's got lots of different benefits. Avoiding scams and isolation and loneliness is another one, another reason. Another thing is, I think this is a great one. Suggest to the senior that they tell the caller or the person at the door that they want everything in writing before they respond to anything. And then if the offer comes in the mail, they can evaluate it. They can call the Better Business Bureau. They can talk to family. They can ask other residents. They can ask all of you about the information. I think that's a simple, and a kind of a good solution instead of, it goes back to that politeness hanging up on the person. You can actually say, hey, you know what? That does sound interesting, but why don't you send it to me in writing? And then also, encouraging seniors to shred all documents. That's another way to prevent fraud. Credit card statements, Social Security information, financial account numbers, all of those. We've seen lots of those shredding days in our communities where they offer a day where you can bring all of your old documents and have them shredded. I think that's a great event and a great idea, and I encourage you in your different communities and different organizations to either host one of those or get the word out when you know about those in your community. Okay, let's continue looking at a few more on the next slide. And this goes back to help the seniors or encourage families to sign up their loved one for the Do Not Call list. And that's donotcall.gov. It's very simple. And this is actually the solution we came to with my grandmother because she just refused to be mean to the people on the phone. And I don't mean mean, I mean hang up on them and be done with it. So we asked her, we're going to go ahead and put you on your phone number on a list so they won't call you. And she said, that would be better. That would just be good. I wouldn't have to worry about answering the phone and listening, because she couldn't hear them most of the time anyway. So we did this twice a year. We put it around key events. So we did it around in the spring. We did the spring cleaning day, and that was the day that we added her back to the Do Not Call list. And then I can't remember when the other one was. But encourage families to have sort of this day, or maybe it's New Year's Day every year. You call and you go online and you put that phone number on the list one more time. And then direct deposit is another option to prevent fraud. Encourage seniors and their families to sign up for direct deposit for those benefit checks that will keep them from being stolen from the mail. Believe it or not, I think it was 3 months ago, I forget what city I was traveling in, and there was a story online of checks being stolen from a mailbox. Again, another thing I hadn't heard in quite a few years, but guess that's still happening as well. And then, again, reminding seniors never to give out credit card information, banking, Social Security, Medicare, none of that personal information unless they initiated the call. I think that's a good tip and a good warning to share with families. And then finally, tell seniors to be skeptical of all those unsolicited offers. Take the time to be that informed consumer. Ask for it in writing. The other thing I often tell families is, and the reason I started telling families this was because of my conversation with Jim. My story I told you earlier when he was asking me about reverse mortgages, I thought, where did he hear about this from? Well, if you've ever watched The Price is Right or some of those daytime shows, the ads in between the commercial ads are all about those. They're targeting seniors. And I'm not saying that they're not they're scams. I'm not saying that at all. But you just have to notice, and that's a good thing for families to understand, what are they seeing on TV? What ads are coming in the mail? There's a lot of things about mobility devices and reverse mortgages on some of those commercials. So making families aware of those, opportunities where they're getting those, that information, very important. Okay, and then one more, my personal fraud prevention tip to all of you is really, this goes back to our families really having that conversation with their loved ones and their parents. And we call this, I know you've heard this before, we've talked about it on these webinars, we call it the 40-70 rule. It's, I'm going to give you the website on the resources, but basically it's really having that conversation when the daughter or son is around 40 and their senior loved one is around 70, and they're having these conversations where we're getting finances in order, we understand where all the documents are, and we're really kind of getting ahead of this before anything can occur. So think of it as a preventative measure, and we've really got to encourage families to have those conversations. I'm going to share the resource with you, though, so you can pass that on. But on the next slide, before we get to the resources, I just want to cover briefly who we can contact if there are any issues. And I think this goes back to seniors not knowing who to report it to, but these are really good tips to share with families as well. We definitely need to call the police. That's probably step number one. We need to file a report with the police department. So seniors need to understand that you can call the police without calling 911, and we need to do a report. Also, the FBI, there's an area on the FBI website that you can file complaints. If anything does happen, this is where closing accounts will be crucial, and I go back to what I just said. When families have those good conversations and they get ahead of it, they know where all the account numbers are, and they can close accounts quickly if something bad does happen. There's a fraud alert that you can put on accounts. So if something happens, you can put a fraud alert on it, and the family will get a call, or the senior will get a call before anything goes through so that they can check it and make sure it's legitimate. And then contacting the Better Business Bureau is another option. You can report a crime on there and a complaint. They are not usually going to help you locate the money, but they can offer support and tips. And a lot of those Better Business Bureaus, they have senior lines, senior scam-specific lines that a person can provide the information and, learn more about it. They also, the Better Business Bureau does a great job of telling you what the latest crime or latest scam is out there so that you're aware of it, because it usually comes in waves in communities. Also, we've talked about adult protective services, family or power of attorney. Those are very important people to contact if any fraud is suspected. Okay, let's go on to resources and talk through those before we open it up for questions. That's on the next slide. So, of course, the FBI is a very great resource, very great website. They have a whole section on scams and safety and fraud. There's also that National Committee for Prevention of Elder Abuse. I talked about that. Those were where the 8 to 10 ideas came about how to prevent fraud. There's the National Center on Elder Abuse has great information. There's the National Adult Protective Services Association. the Home Instead Senior Care on caregiverstress.com has some great information. There's a Protect Seniors from Fraud kit. It's downloadable and it's free. It's a great resource to share with families. It's got checklists, and it's got ways that families can kind of scam-proof the house. I encourage you all to get that, look at it, print it out, have it on hand for families. And then remember the MetLife study. That was another document that you can go look at as well. I'm sorry, I'm getting a tickle in my throat again. So let's look, last slide, next slide. The next steps is I just want you to think about, we've gone over tons of information today. We've talked about the 3 types of scams. They were scams of occasion, desperation, and predation. We've talked about why seniors are the targets. We learned about some of the signs. And so I think that's probably the biggest bit of information that you can take to families. We've looked at some prevention tips as well. So hopefully you've learned some resources. Hopefully you've got some information that you can share with families. And I know it's likely many of you are going to be working with families that might be facing some of these challenges. So hope you learn something that you can share with them today. So I'm going to turn it back over to Steve and open the phone line up for questions. Thanks again, all of you, for being here.
All right. Thanks very much, Molly. Great presentation, as always. We'd also like to welcome Erin Albers from Home Instead Senior Care to the line for the Q&A period here.
Thank you.
Okay. Let's jump to it right here, presenters. What are the best ways to prevent a scam by an external caregiver that a person with dementia depends on?
To prevent, is that what it said, Steve, to prevent?
Yeah.
Well, I think one of the biggest things to prevent an external caregiver is really understanding everything you can about that caregiver. And I of course, am going to go right to when a family hires an independent caregiver or a caregiver from a caregiving company, you've got to make sure they have background checks done, they've been drug tested, and that they've got some training. I mean, I think that's step one. And especially if it is an independent situation, when you are hiring a caregiver, are there references? Are there other people that they can call and check in on? But I think when it comes to preventing fraud and scams, the number one thing that can be done is a background check to really ensure that nothing has happened from a legal aspect. But again, understanding the references of the person, their experience, are they bondable and insurable? So if something does happen, if this person steals or does something terrible, is there insurance involved that can cover that cost so that it wouldn't affect the family and wouldn't affect the senior? So as far as prevention goes, I think you've got to be very proactive in hiring the right caregiver from the start.
Okay, you mentioned earlier people sending in some tips, and here's one of those. Proper estate planning with an elder law attorney helps eliminate some fraud. It is important to suggest that older adults and their families do planning. This will help with family members taking advantage of an older adult and will protect money, especially if it's the correct type of trust for their situation.
That's a great point. And that goes back to my point about the 4070. And by the way, it's 4070talk.com. That wasn't on the slide, but that's what I mean by that conversation. Families need to be having that conversation. And when you have those conversations, that's where you definitely say, okay, if we want to talk about the money side, let's talk to our elder law attorney or a financial planner or somebody that's sort of an impartial party between the family and the senior to really, that's their specialty is helping families avoid any issues and problems in the future. So that was an excellent point. Thank you very much for sending that in.
Okay, next question. What are your thoughts on freezing credit? What are the negatives to doing so if they don't plan to use that credit?
I don't know, not being in the financial world, I don't know what the disadvantages and advantages of freezing credit are. I apologize. I think that sounds like it could be something to investigate, because it sounds like it could be a decent solution or a decent, a good thought. I think it's a great idea, a great thought, but I would just have to investigate that a little more to know what are the pros and cons of that idea, of that concept. I apologize for not.
Right.
I don't want to give the wrong answer, the wrong information, so I'm just going to tell you I don't know the answer on that, and I apologize.
Right. I think one resource that we have that will help walk through those types of questions that come up is a Senior Fraud Protection Kit, and it kind of walks through all the financial aspects and everything and really brings up those questions like the credit question. And you can actually find the Senior Fraud Protection Kit at protectseniorsfromfraud.com. That's protectseniorsfromfraud.com. You can download a kit there and then walk through that with family, financial advisors, etc.
Okay, Molly, can you repeat the website for the 40/70 rule that you mentioned earlier?
Yes, it's 4070talk.com.
4070talk.com. Okay, perfect.
Yes. Next
question.
I missed that. Okay, go ahead, Steve. Sorry.
Okay, sure. No problem. All right, okay, this is a great one here. Any advice for talking with seniors who are victims of exploitation by a person that they trust, but they don't believe that they're actually being scammed by this person? Tough question.
Very tough question, and that goes right back to my personal story when I had to deal with that myself. One of the approaches that we took was we had to take in evidence. And it wasn't a lot of, papers and, it was just kind of something in the back pocket. And the other thing that we really did was we came at it from the aspect of, boy, we love you a lot. And, you kind of go to this place of we're just really concerned. Some things are not adding up. And you got to be very delicate because you're basically about to tell them somebody very close to them is a terrible person, and they know and love them. And so the other piece of advice that we used a lot was because the person immediately that I dealt with went into denial and went into sort of a place of that's not right, and they got very upset. And it was more of a once they kind of calmed down, and we explained what that meant to them. So financially saying, here's what the deal is. And we had to say this to this lovely lady. We said, you know what? Her name was Sally. We said, Sally, if we don't stop this now, you're going to have to move out of your house because you don't have any money. You won't have any money left to pay the bills. And that's when it sort of hit her like, oh boy. What? I mean, I've lost that much money. And so I think that you have to be very gentle. It's a very difficult conversation, but I think, coming at it with your heart, your heart's in the right place, and you're coming from a place of love and concern and support, and that you're going to be there with them through this whole thing. And then you kind of present the evidence, and then you kind of say, because that's sort of the pattern. When they sort of calm down, it's more like, okay, but really, if we don't get this fixed, here's the 2 or 3 things that are going to happen if you don't. And I think when you present it that way, that's when it comes a little bit more reality. And we did a lot of, I'm so sorry this happened to you. This isn't your fault. We had to do a lot of reassuring about this wasn't your fault. You didn't, nothing wrong. This person, and we actually danced around the person too, saying this person, your granddaughter, she just fell into some hard times. And, so we tried not to make the person a total, villain, but yet she took it too far, kind of a thing. So it's a delicate conversation. I apologize that you have to, I feel sorry that you have to have that. I wish you luck, whoever out there has to have that conversation. I hope some of those tips help just from my own personal story.
Okay, well, Molly and Aaron, we have reached the end of our hour here, and we are just about out of time today, but I want to thank you again for another fantastic presentation and for being here with us today. Thank you.
Yes, thank you all so much.